Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today we're talking about freelance camera, and my guest is a production veteran with stories to share. Rick Nyburg, you've been carrying a camera on your shoulder for more than 30 years. Welcome to Below the Line.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you, Rick. A little bit of backstory to share with our listeners. You and I met because, well, I'm a baseball fan. And around this time last year, I was looking for production crew to talk about working behind the scenes at a Dodgers game. Now, that episode didn't come together, but we stayed in touch. And now, with another regular season concluded and the MLB playoffs currently underway, it seemed timely to revisit the topic. But before I pick your brain about your years covering the Dodgers for Fox Sports, tell me about your background and how you got into freelance camera work.
Well, I actually started out as a still photographer. I didn't even come to LA till after I left college. And I had an engineering degree, so I thought I was going to be an engineer. But when I got here, there were PhDs in the unemployment line. So I thought, well, what I really wanted to be was a photographer. I went back to school for 2 more years just to get an AA in photography and design, opened my studio in Manhattan Beach and married a stewardess. And I thought, life is good.
What years was it when you came back to LA?
I came to LA in 69, opened my studio in 72, and both the studio and my marriage ended in 1980, coincidentally. I think that's a good run, and you know, we're still friends. She invites me over to dinner every once in a while, but we were just going in different directions. But at that point, I thought I would switch my career to television, to video, because I thought, A, that was where the market was going. I wanted to stay ahead of the curve. And also with my engineering background, I felt I had an advantage over a lot of still cameramen because the cameras and the electronic gear that made video in 1980 were pretty complex. So I, with a friend, and that was the beginning of the cable television industry, really, with the government mandated that every new cable network needed to provide public access. So there was a huge market of people who wanting to produce public access. And so a friend of mine and I built a studio in Hermosa Beach, and another friend who was kind of our sales guy went and found the clients. And this was really weird circumstances. Another friend of mine who was an airline pilot had built a complete 3-camera truck as a hobby and gave me the keys. He trusted me with the keys. So I put the studio together with a 3-camera truck, and we shot over 200 shows that first summer in between 1980 and 1982. We shot the pilot for Paul Rubens to do the Pee-wee's Playhouse. We shot 3 music videos that were on the air on MTV the first year. So yeah, that was kind of launched me. At least that was my hands-on training for video production, because I would do everything from camera to directing in the truck to editing. So that was the start. It took a few years after that to really get into professional video, into getting hired as a crew member. But, by the end of that decade, I certainly was, I was at ABC News. It's kind of interesting because I think the ABC News, I worked there for about a year, and I felt like if I did the same job every day, I would learn to hate it. So I kind of set my mind at that point to be freelance intentionally, because I felt like if I did work the same job, learn to hate it. Whereas it's a constant challenge if you're doing, ABC News one day and Discovery Channel another day and CNN another day and Fox Sports another day. It really causes a little bit of anxiety, but that's a good thing. It keeps you on your toes.
And so this is the 90s then that you're taking gigs wherever they are, and then have a variety of clients. Have you closed the studio at this point? Is freelance becoming like a full-time focus, or are you still balancing between these smaller customers and these larger gigs?
The studio lease was up in 83, so we only had that studio for 3 years. And I couldn't get anyone to sign the lease to renew it. I even created a prospectus to kind of shop it to get some investors, and it didn't really succeed, but like I say, it was a great education. I'm still friends with all those people anyway.
And at this point, then, as you mentioned, you're doing ABC News. What kind of other gigs would be, I don't know, a move up the ladder, or what sort of opportunities were there in this? Are we mid 90s, late 90s now?
Mid 90s, I guess. Yeah. Because I didn't start at ABC News till 99. So there was a long time in there of just picking up freelance jobs. I found a niche with companies that owned gear and needed a crew. There was one company called Televitics, which oddly was started by a Chevrolet dealer because they spent so much money filming their commercials. They figured they'd build their own production company in-house, and then it would go around and do other jobs. I mean, we did the Christmas parade in Whittier or whatever, some city Christmas Day parade. We did some shoots at actually earlier than that, mid 90s. In 86, we did, that was my first job at Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, was for this company. And they covered the Voyager Close Encounters press conferences, both in 86 and 89, when Voyager 1 and then Voyager 2, closest visit to the outer planets. And I thought, what a great gig. I get 2 weeks every 3 years. It's like, but again, it was great experience though, to be there at JPL. That was my first introduction to JPL, and that was quite exciting for me. I've always been a science geek, and I even built rockets as a kid in high school, and was a member of the National Association of Rocketry, built and launched my own rockets back then.
Well, spoiler alert, we're going to come back to that. Catch me up, though, to your time with Fox Sports. If I'm correct, started around 2000. Where was that introduction, and what was it like working with that team?
I think my connection with Fox Sports really came around because, as I said, I found a niche where I would be friends with people that owned a lot of gear. And I had several cameramen friends that started to be in that market, and they would turn their garage into a studio, and they'd have 3, 4, 5 packages of camera gear, tripod, lighting, camera, audio, all that was necessary. So the first package that got hired, they went out and did that job, but every subsequent, they would hire their friends who, like me, and I established a pretty good reputation. And it was one of those friends that I think sent me on the first Fox Sports, and then it became kind of a regular thing. I really enjoyed that. We did everything from covering the Lakers when they were back at the Forum to covering the Galaxy when they first came to town, and then the Dodger games. So I did a little bit of all of that, and probably have stories for each of them. I mean, my favorite stories with the Lakers, I got sent out to do an interview with Kobe Bryant when he first showed up to town when he was 18. And the Lakers, their workout center at that time was Loyola Marymount University on the west side of LA. And I went out to shoot them, do the interview. And of course, you kind of approach and you let the publicist, whatever, know you're there. And then you kind of stand back until you're called. So I'm waiting and I'm waiting. I'm checking my exposure. I'm looking at the lighting. So that I can be immediately ready to walk up and hit the button as soon as they walk up. Of course, they brought Kobe and Shaquille together. At that point, they were like brothers. Shaquille was treating Kobe like his little brother and kind of showing him the ropes and everything. So when they first walked up, I had no idea how tall Shaquille was. And, I tilted my camera up to include him in the shot, and I'm shooting right into the skylights in the ceiling. And it's like, my shot is ruined before I've even started. So I was not ready to push that button. And that stuck with me for a long time. Shaquille also, he was kind of a jokester and had a great sense of humor. And I remember one time they sent me to the Forum. The assignment was, get a shot, because he would drive into the tunnel at the Forum and park his SUV. I think it was an Escalade or a Suburban, whatever. And then he would walk down the tunnel, and they said, get a shot of him walking down the tunnel. Maybe put the camera down on the ground or get low, So I did. I got down on the ground. I got low of Shaquille walking in, looking huge. And then he kept walking, and I got up and put it on my shoulder, and I'm walking backwards to continue the shot. And there's another cameraman joins me, just to my right. And I'm kind of annoyed. He's getting kind of the same shot. I don't know if he was there, maybe he was the in-house camera or whatever. And we're walking backwards quite briskly. And there was another SUV behind us, which you didn't see. And the door was left open. The other cameraman slammed right into that open door backwards and almost knocked him over. And Shaquille, just laughed and we kept walking. On those games, very similar to the when I was doing the Dodger games, I would be the one camera that was not connected to the truck. So I would run out and get that shot, and then a runner would pick up the tape and send it back to the truck. And the same thing. So during the Lakers games, I would just stand in an aisle and wait to be called. And then whenever they're, halftime and at the end, I would go in the locker room and get some footage, in the hallways of them coming and going, or at the end of the game, get interviews in the locker room.
So to give us a sense of how that was set up. So at the time, the cameras that are recording the game and for broadcast, they're all wired to the truck. Is that right? Like, and there's an operator there, but they're on it. Tell me about headsets. Like, they're getting commands from someone in a control center. Tell us a little bit more about how that's set up for folks who might not be aware, and then how you come in and fit into it.
I had the kind of luck of the draw of being the extra camera. When you get to a game, whether it's at the Lakers in the Forum or the Dodgers at Dodger Stadium, there's multiple cameras hardwired to the truck, which is out in the parking lot. Any number, 12, 14 cameras, who knows. And then I was an extra camera and I was not hardwired. I would have a runner with me, and these were the days of Betacam. So before the game, I would go up to the top of Dodger Stadium, get some pretty scenics of the skyline of LA, maybe a close-up shot of somebody cashing in their tickets, a shot of somebody buying merchandise, whatever, some color shots. And then my runner, who would be with me, would then run that tape down to the truck so they could just fit that into the ongoing broadcast while it was in progress. Then my next assignment, I would go down to the field, onto the field, maybe in the dugout, or maybe get some shots of batting practice, usually the warm-ups. And usually there was, a couple players that were the hot topic of the day, and the manager would be there, hopefully. So we would get an interview with the manager and or whoever was the hot topic players of the day, what was the subject matter. And again, the runner would then run that tape back up. And it was an ongoing process while the broadcast has already started. All the pregame broadcast has already started, and they would feed my shots into the broadcast just as if it were a connected camera. Once the game started, though, my job was kind of done, and I would go sit up in the press box, watch the game from the press box, and I would stand by with my camera. And I think in those days we were probably on a pager because there weren't cell phones like now. So they would page me and I would, call the truck or run down to the truck. And then all things being normal, after I watched the game from the press box and had a nice lunch or dinner, then I would maybe middle of the eighth, end of the eighth inning, go down and wait outside the locker room. And a producer would usually come with me or meet me there. We'd go into the locker room after the game. And again, whatever was the topic of the day, we would get quick interviews, and a runner again would run it back to the truck and get it into the broadcast before the broadcast ended. So it was really fun for me. And, again, keeps you on your toes. You've got to be paying attention at all times. And I got to enjoy the games.
Now, you talked earlier about you thought that if you had be at ABC every day doing the same thing, you might have gotten sick of it. In this environment behind the scenes, like with the baseball game, is it mostly fans, or do folks become jaded about the game as well? Not just maybe you as a freelance, it breaks it up, but also the crews that were working this day in and day out.
That's a good question. I don't think I really saw anyone that got jaded. Everyone that I worked with seemed to enjoy the assignment and enjoy the game as much as anyone else. It's never the same. Every game is different, and you might be down in the dugout when somebody has a bad day and kicks a whole box of candy across the dugout, or throws their glove across the room, or like I say, you got to pay attention and stay focused. And it's, yeah, never a dull moment. Or maybe Bill Maher comes walking out of the club room and says hi or something.
Favorite stories from that time, particular games you remember or players that you interacted with?
Wow. That's a hard one. Yeah, it's so long ago, and B, there's so many, games, so much water over the dam. I guess a high point would be not the Dodgers, but I would sometimes cover other teams and have other clients other than the Fox Sports. And I covered, I'm not even sure who my client, if it was another cable network, where I covered the White Sox game at Anaheim against the Angels, the ALCS series in 2005. And I was there for the game that they won the series. And of course, all the, you've seen this on TV, I'm sure, but all the champagne, and they warned us that this could happen, wear rain gear. And also we had a raincoat for the camera. So, but yeah, I certainly had champagne poured down my neck and sprayed in my face and every other place. So I guess that would be pretty much a high point because you don't know for sure when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen that game.
Yeah, I can only imagine that was surreal. I see it on TV and they do a pretty good job of making you feel up close to it, but to actually be there.
Yeah, it's like again, you see it on TV. It's very different when you're in the middle of it, and because you can see the champagne is going everywhere. But I'm more concerned that the camera is going to fail. A little champagne isn't going to hurt me. I can take a shower when I get home. But luckily, those cameras are built pretty robustly. I think the worst was I covered for 2 years. I did a high school sports show. That was even before the Fox Sports stuff. I did a show at the time, it was called the LA Times High School Sports Show. I only did that for 2 seasons, mainly because it was too much work for not enough money, but it was really enjoyable. It taught me a lot about the younger generation coming up and really gave me an appreciation. I participated in high school sports myself, and I've already learned a tremendous value for team sports and high school sports and what it teaches anyone growing up. The idea of teamwork, the idea of dedication, the idea of hard work can pay off, and also just how good it feels to be in physical shape, to test your body and to push that to see how far you can go. But we covered one high school football game that was very unusual for LA in the idea that it was pouring rain. I mean, it was rain coming down in sheets. And I couldn't imagine that they were still going to play, but they did. And it was one of those games that you may have seen where, the runner gets tackled and then slides about 10 feet in the mud, throwing up a wake. And I'm out there on the field and I'm soaked to my skin. And again, I was afraid that the camera would fail. And even the idea of having to change the tape, Betacam tape, I had to go into my car, dry everything off, take the raincoat off the camera, put a new tape in, put it all back together, and go back out in the rain. And since we were really shooting just for highlights, I mean, I could afford to miss a couple of minutes, but that camera lasted for the whole game. So that was quite an experience. Oddly enough, when we went into the locker room to do the post game, the lens fogged up internally, and that was the end of it. We could no longer shoot anything. We didn't get any post game interviews. We got audio only, but there was just totally fogged up. So it did fail at that level, but there was nothing we could do about that. It held up for the whole game. So that was a lot of fun. That's how I really learned to shoot kind of every sport, that by highlights, what to look for, where to be as a cameraman. Like for basketball, you've got a couple of positions, but under the basket is where you're going to get baskets. And that's mostly what you want for highlight reels. Where to be for water polo, where to be for baseball. The hardest one I learned is shooting soccer. If you're a single camera shooting highlights, the very first game, I think, the soccer match I got sent to, I arrived like 5 minutes late and it was already 1-0. and I shot the entire rest of the game, and it ended 1-0. So I had virtually no highlights for that entire match. So soccer is a unique sport in that regard, shooting highlight reels. But every other sport, we figured it out pretty well. But like I say, I was really impressed with how many, people want to tell you the younger generation is going to hell in a handbasket and taking us with them. And I found quite the opposite. There were tremendous numbers of dedicated students, not only dedicated to their academics, but dedicated to their sports, working their butts off and doing the right thing. And they had a great support system. We would, once a week, we would pick an athlete of the week, and we would actually go to their home, interview them at home with their parents. We would interview their coaches. We would interview their teammates and do a little feature on that high school athlete. And many of those went on to become nationally known athletes. So it was a good friend of mine, Jake Downey, that was kind of the mastermind. He was an aficionado and really followed sports and kind of knew a little bit about every sport. And he would just read the stats and pick once a week, would pick an athlete, and he did a really good job of picking them.
Yeah, it was Jake Downey that introduced us.
Exactly. He's my sports aficionado if I have a sports question.
Well, I want to set aside the mud of the field and take us to the red carpet. I understand somewhat in parallel of doing the sports work, you also started working for Access Hollywood. Tell me about how that came about, how it was different, and your experiences there.
Well, interestingly enough, one of my best friends, another cameraman that we started out in the business together. In fact, way back in, 82, 83, he was one of the cameramen I hired to run camera at when I had the video studio. And we stayed in touch. And in, I guess it was about late 90s, 96, 97, he called me up and he said, "Hey, they're starting this new show over at NBC called Access Hollywood. And I'm applying. You should come over and jump in here. And this was one of the stupid decisions I made. I said, Access Hollywood, what a stupid name. It sounds like public access or something. and I didn't respond right away. And then, within a very short period of time, less than a year, I was like, and I saw what Access Hollywood was. It was basically a competitor to ET or Entertainment Tonight. And they meant access, to Hollywood, just the name, like the name says. And so, I was calling him up. I called him back, but it wasn't immediately. There was several month delay, and I called him up, said, "Hey, yeah." And he goes, "Oh, they hired 2 guys. I'm one of them, but come on over and we'll see if we can get you in." So it was 2 years after that, I think, before I finally got called at Access Hollywood. So I kind of missed the opening salvo, but I was still in kind of at the beginning. I think my first shoot for them was 99, and it was a great time. I mean, it was, and to give you an idea of the difference as a freelancer and starting out as a photographer and being a cameraman, I always valued making pretty pictures, even though that sounds superficial. There's a skill to making a picture that people want to see or like. And I felt like shooting the news, there's really no call for, framing and focus and lighting and all that, because you don't really have time. You're shooting a news event. Where you can shoot from is limited. The amount of time you have to shoot is very limited. So when you get back to the station, it's like, is there sound? Is there picture? Roll it, Whereas once I got working at Access Hollywood and I would run into other cameraman buddies and everything, and they go, a show like that actually cares about making pretty pictures. If again, forgive the cliche, but we're shooting Hollywood celebrities or actors or directors or whoever, and we're being paid to make the talent look good. We might show up at a hotel room and have 2 hours to make it look like not a hotel room, with flattering lighting and complementary colors and low depth of field so the background is out of focus, all those kind of photographic tricks. So people would say, "Oh, you work for Access Hollywood, you must be good." So I took that as a indication I had made the right choice. And I stayed with them for, basically 20 years. I was never full-time. I was what they call in the industry permalance or permanent freelance. but I was working for most of that time. I was working 4 or 5 days a week, which was plenty for me. And it still gave me room and time to, go do a shoot for Fox Sports or to do a shoot for Discovery Channel or whoever else called. I can't speak for other cameramen in that field, but I really enjoyed it. I love the movies. I have always enjoyed, a good drama on TV, and I really enjoyed meeting and working with some of my favorite actors. I seemed very blessed for all those years to get to meet and talk to some of my favorite actors and actresses.
Now, you're talking about working there for over 2 decades. They changed their model. Tell me about some of the changes that led to budget cuts and how Access Hollywood evolved into really a different kind of show.
Well, you're absolutely correct. In the early 2000s, we had plenty of budget. We were working a lot of overtime. We were getting a lot of meal penalties because, as per union rules, if you work X amount of hours and don't get a meal break, that's a penalty that it's added on to the end of your day. And because we were doing set visits and red carpet events and things like that, where the talent really is a priority, we have to wait for when they are free. So we don't get to take that break. So yeah, we took that as kind of a badge of courage that, we could work through our meal breaks and get paid for it. That was fine because we made more money that way. That went on for probably a good, well, really the change was, I'll give you one more example. When the crew, I didn't get to go with them, but when the crew from Access Hollywood went to the Athens Olympics, was that 2008 or 2004? I forget. And of course, we had the leading contingent for beach volleyball were 4 women from Manhattan Beach and Hermosa Beach that did go end up winning the gold and the silver medal, those 2 pairs. And our producer, because the camera crews were stuck there at the beach volleyball all day, which may not sound like a horrible assignment, but it is if you can't leave and you're stuck there and it's hot sun and whatever. But the producer at the end of the day, bought a case of beer for the crew, and everybody loved that. And I heard that story, even though I wasn't there. Well, he got fired after coming back from the Athens Olympics for going over budget, whatever, because he was treating the crew really well. That kind of permeated, and then it really escalated when Comcast bought NBC Universal in 2009, and they just started slashing and burning. They pretty much told all of our on-camera talent that if they wanted to stay, they would need to take a 10% pay cut. So we lost Tony Potts, we lost Nancy O'Dell. They were not about to take a pay cut. And my assignments went from 4 or 5 days a week to 4 or 5 days a month with one phone call because they could. And, in all fairness, the changes were happening throughout the industry. It's not like they were just being greedy. All the executives were already fearing cable cutters and the changing of habits because, in 2000, people would actually sit down in front of their TV at 7:30 to watch Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood. By 2009, that already was not happening. DVRs existed and people were recording what they wanted, and YouTube was coming about. You could watch clips on YouTube, which is much more common now. So the show, if you watched Access Hollywood today, it's not the same show. I think I mentioned before, but our Access Hollywood crew room, we went from 5 shoots a day to 2 shoots a day. So there just was not enough material to fill a half-hour show. So if you turn on the show today, it's mostly, some of the same talent. It's Mario and Kit Hoover. And anyway, mostly they're in the studio talking about whatever the news is, and they'll show a few clips. Whereas our show back in the day was mostly clips, it was heavy on content. So, and every part of the industry has changed that way. I could feel bitter, but the whole job of freelancing has been adapting to the changes over the years. My one nod to bitterness, I guess, was, that by the end of 2009, when I had, lost most of that work for Access Hollywood, Comcast posted a record $6.3 billion profit. So great bonuses went to their executives and their shareholders, but I felt like that came right out of my pocket, but that's corporate America. That's where we live right now. So bitterness doesn't get you very far. Creativity and adaptability is, your stock and trade.
Well, Rick, that also reminds me of something you said earlier about how union rules were getting you meal penalties. Give me a sense of what the union was like during this time. In other words, when you were starting out and all this cable was starting up, was there a fully developed union then that you had to join, or was the union sort of growing as this demand for video work was increasing at the same time?
Well, I would say, I've kind of lived through that whole arc. It was growing when I first started. I think by the end, the union, I felt like, had lost most of its power. And I suppose we could take that all the way back to Reagan, but, when he started union busting. But I felt like the unions, by the end of the time, were kind of shooting themselves in the foot, and really not keeping up with the times, to the extent that, advice I give young people starting out in the industry, I would say, plan for your retirement. That's one thing I did not plan well for. And by being that category of permalance as opposed to full time, they had us sign start paperwork every year. So on paper, I did not work for Access Hollywood, or I did not work for NBC for 20 years. I worked for NBC 20 times for 1 year, which meant they were not responsible for contributing to my 401k or whatever, or any pension, any retirement plan. That was totally my responsibility. And, I guess I would say I was young and stupid. And I would have signed the paperwork anyway, but I wish some union guy would have pulled me aside and said, go ahead and sign the paperwork, but this is what this means, that any retirement fund or any pension is totally up to you. So I would highly recommend that you do that, because it may feel difficult to put that money aside now, but it's going to get even more difficult 20 years from now.
Sound advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great job and it's a great career. And I've been very blessed. I've had so many memorable moments. But like I say, that's one thing I would have done differently, is plan better for my retirement.
So, Rick, your time on the red carpets, Golden Globes, etc. What do you got of celebrity stories?
This actually wasn't for Access Hollywood, but one of my favorite clients, interestingly enough, was Italian television. I did a stint for a couple of years as kind of their LA based camera, and they sent me to the Golden Globes and the Oscars and a bunch of fun stuff. But my favorite part for them was they did a whole series of long form, like half-hour interviews with celebrities, so that we actually had time to spend. With Access Hollywood and a lot of the other outlets, you're usually on a clock, literally a stopwatch. When the publicist comes in the room, you might have 5 minutes or 15 minutes with the talent, whatever celebrity it is, and then they have to move on and do the next interview with the next outlet. But with Italian TV, we were shooting at least a half an hour of footage, so we would have like 2 hours with whoever the talent was. And for example, we rented a suite at the Hotel Bel Air to do an interview with Meryl Streep. And you can imagine that would be intimidating anyone to, meet up with Meryl Streep and what's she going to be like. And, I'm just a cameraman. But she arrived without an entourage. I think she had a personal assistant, but no hair, no makeup, no publicist. And I was still setting cameras and lights up and tweaking. And I saw her kind of out of the corner of my eye walk in and, greet our host, the producer. And she kind of looked around the room to see who was doing what. And this was so old school. She saw that I was, the cameraman, that I was tweaking the lights and everything. She walked right over and introduced herself to me and shook my hand. Hi, I'm Meryl Streep. And so I thought that was so old school Hollywood, that if you're on camera, get to know your cameraman. He's the one that's going to make you look good. And, in fact, we did. And she was quite delightful. I mean, she even said off camera, she said one of her comments was, I can be that Meryl Streep that you see up on screen, but that's not who I really am, meaning she really knows when to throw her weight around. And certainly she can do that and has been known to do that. But she was very down to earth with us and quite delightful. And in that same string of interviews, we also interviewed Quentin Tarantino at the Four Seasons Hotel. Our producer, the Italian, was this Italian woman producer, and they got talking about Italian films because he has such an encyclopedic knowledge of films. And there was a whole series of films, Italian films, from the spaghetti westerns on, that were often released with a double title, with a different title in English. And he knew all those titles, both the English and the Italian title. And she was quite impressed. He was equally impressed with her knowledge of Italian films. And I was part of that conversation. And I brought up the question. I go, Quentin, is it true you learned much of your film knowledge from working in a video store? And he goes, yes, that's absolutely true. And I said, is it also true that video store was in Manhattan Beach? And he said, yes. How did you know that? And he goes, wait a minute. I remember you. You were one of my customers. You were checking out all those foreign films, weren't you? And I said, guilty as charged. And so we had a real hoot, remembering back to the video store days in Manhattan Beach. And he was absolutely right. I did check out, I was very big on, Fellini, Antonioni, Vittorio De Sico, I guess that was the Italian New Wave following, I don't know if that had a different name, but following the French New Wave. I obviously loved the French films too, Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. And anyway, so yeah, that was really fun. And then probably the third favorite interview we did from that series was Daryl Hannah. And we borrowed a house on the beach in Malibu at Paradise Cove for that one. And again, she arrived with no assistant, no producer, no publicist, just all by herself, driving her station wagon that had been converted to run on biofuel, because she was an early activist on the environment. That was delightful. As she said her favorite film was still Blade Runner. My favorite memory from that was she ordered lunch from the Paradise Cove restaurant, which was 100 yards down the beach, and we sent somebody down to pick up her lunch for her, and brought it back and gave her lunch. And she was vegetarian. She had ordered a big portobello mushroom sandwich, and she sat down at the table, cut the sandwich in half, and handed me half and said, "Would you join me for lunch?" That was a great moment to be able to sit and have lunch with Daryl Hannah.
Classic.
I got a great picture with that from that day. In those days, everybody didn't have a cell phone and didn't take pictures of everything. I did carry a 35 millimeter camera with me through most of my career, but in those days, it was not considered appropriate. You didn't bring out your camera and take pictures of some talent on the set.
Right.
And you certainly didn't take selfies with them, with arm around them like is so common now. So it was only on rare occasions that I would ask, is it, can we get a picture together? And of course she said, of course. I sent that to some of my college buddies, and at our next reunion, they were like, where's Daryl? I thought you were bringing Daryl. So from that point on, they nicknamed me Hollywood. I'd say in my college days, it was, I went to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. I was attempting to follow in the footsteps of my father, who was an Annapolis graduate and served 30 years in the Navy as a pilot. I served 6 years, and the Navy and I had an amicable divorce, but I still consider them family, and I still get together once a year to watch the Army-Navy game with my Academy classmates.
Very nice. Well, Rick, we teased it earlier. You mentioned doing the press conferences for Voyager with the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, but I know you've been back there in the last decade as well.
Well, when my work for Access Hollywood went from, 4 days a week to 4 days a month, I started looking around for other opportunities. And at a trade show at the CineGear conference held on the Paramount studio lot every year, I ran into an old friend that I had known from CNN. And I asked him, what was he doing? And he goes, "Oh, I'm over at JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena." And I said, "Oh, that's super exciting. I love that place. I've been over there several times and I told him about the Voyager project, and I'd been over there for Discovery Channel." And he said, "Well, would you be interested in working there? I think we have an opening coming up." I was like, "Absolutely." So, I went online and filled out the paperwork online, and sure enough, got hired there as again, a permalancer. They only call me when they need me, but I worked there for 12 years, starting in 2011. So I got to be in the control room when we landed the rover Curiosity on Mars. And that was definitely a career high point. It's quite an experience. I mean, hopefully people have seen that on TV when that happens. And, we're not rocket scientists, we're a TV crew, and we're actually kind of making a TV show about this. So we actually have a script, and we rehearsed that script like 3 times leading up to the actual landing. And it's based, we have a timeline of what the scientists expect to be happening over that period of time. And then we're trying to line up who are we going to interview, what's our most likely shot going to be. So we have kind of a, script just of how that's going to go down. We even ran one rehearsal with a computer anomaly as if we lost contact with the lander and weren't sure what had happened. So we felt pretty confident. But the one thing that we didn't rehearse, and you couldn't really rehearse, was when it actually happened and everything went perfectly according to plan, and that burst of emotion from the scientists, many of whom have spent 10 years or more on this project. This is like a major part of their scientific career. And that outpouring of emotion at that moment when that first image came back from the surface of Mars, where they all knew immediately this was a total success, everything has gone perfectly, that in fact they even did that great video, 7 Minutes of Terror, that kind of outlines all the things that have to go properly autonomously, because as the spacecraft is going through the atmosphere, they cannot talk to it because of the plasma wave that's around it prevents any radio signals. So it's totally autonomous from the time it enters the atmosphere until the time it touches down on the ground. And again, everything went perfectly, and just that burst of emotion was, you felt it through your whole body, and it's like, wow. So that was amazing. That was quite an event. I got to do that. I was handheld camera in the control room for that landing. And then I got to do the InSight landing, which was not a rover, it was a seismometer. That was in 2019, I believe. And we won an Emmy for that coverage, Emmy Award. And actually, prior to that, I don't know if you remember the Cassini mission, which was 20 years orbiting Saturn. When that mission came to its end, before the ship ran out of fuel to maneuver, they flew it into the atmosphere and burned it up so as not to contaminate the planet or any of its moons, which we hope to study later. Even though all the spacecraft go through a complete decontamination here on Earth before we launch them, that's 99.9% safe. There's a 0.01% that there's some microbial life on that spacecraft. So just to be absolutely certain, they burned it up in the atmosphere. And they were smart enough. JPL has been pretty smart about their public persona. They've had a robust television department and a robust social media department, because they realize without public engagement, they don't get their funding from Congress. So that Cassini mission, they turned into a public campaign, and we won an Emmy for that one also. So we were on all over YouTube, we were on Twitter, we were on Facebook. I think every one of the JPL missions has its own Facebook page. And, that they got the school kids to name the rover, to name Curiosity and to name Perseverance, the most recent one. So I won 2 Emmys there for that coverage. My only regret was I wasn't there, even though I was technically on staff for the most recent one, 2022, the Perseverance rover landed. after the pandemic, they did not bring us back. They only did that with a skeleton crew, and they did not win an Emmy for that coverage. So, I understand. Again, it's a very high security and high value facility. And, again, we're not rocket scientists. We're just the TV crew. So out of an abundance of caution, as we like to say, they did not bring us back on lab for that coverage.
Well, and then they didn't get an Emmy for it. You got to invest in the production side of things if you want to really capture these moments.
Exactly. Like Access Hollywood, it's not the same show anymore.
So, Rick, your freelance career has spanned more than 30 years. You're still working freelance camera now. Any reflections on how it's changed or just looking at the entire timeline, thoughts about this kind of work in general?
Well, I guess it goes back to what I said earlier that, being able to adapt and change. I had one girlfriend that, after living with me for a couple of years, said that, working freelance was living by your wits. She also said that my alarm bells were not working. Things got tight. The alarm should have gone off, she felt like. But every aspect has changed. The nature of the cameras. I started out shooting tube cameras and recording on 1 inch or 3/4 inch tape. And now they're, chip cameras, and they record on digital media, whether it's a card or a hard drive or a thumb drive or some sort of completely different media. So when I started, there was, in broadcast end of it, there was less than half a dozen cameras that were the standard, of the industry. And actually, most of them were all Betacam for many of those years. When you picked up a camera, you knew instantly all the buttons and knobs and everything in the viewfinder and how to work it. Now, there's probably a minimum of 10 different cameras. If I show up on a shoot, at least 10 different cameras that I might be using. And it's almost impossible to completely know every one of them. You at least have to have a basic knowledge of how to operate it, how to turn it on, what are the basic minimums that you need to know. And then you turn it on, and every one of these cameras now has like a 27-page menu in the viewfinder. So your questions, you have a question right away to the producer before you even start the shoot. What format am I shooting? 2K, 4K, 1080, what codec am I shooting? Maybe you need to call and ask the editor. Sometimes the producer doesn't even know. Am I shooting ProRes? Am I shooting whatever the format is that's going to go to the editor? So it's tremendously more complicated now than it was when I started. As a freelancer, that puts the burden on me. I've always felt like I kind of need to know at least the basics of any camera that I might pick up. Otherwise, the other end of the industry has changed as well, where that show is going to go. The number of producers, the number of outlets, it's probably now going to streaming, or it might, I've even shot commercials where I was requested to shoot the vertical format and shoot it on my iPhone because that's where it's going to air, is on people's iPhones, whether it's TikTok or, many clients are now airing their commercials on the phone. So, yeah, kind of from top to bottom, the industry has changed. I guess, like I said, that it just means even more so that you need to be able to adapt to change and be able to be fluent. And, I've always felt like the continuing education was totally necessary in this job. Like I said, to go to the NAB or to go to CineGear and at least see what all the new cameras are that are coming out. Lighting has dramatically changed. I mean, we were still using quartz lighting when I started, and then went to KinoFlow, fluorescent lighting. Now everything is LED, which is a dramatic improvement, that as far as power consumption, you don't need to plug into, blow somebody's fuse at their house. It can even be battery powered. You can be in and out in a couple hours and not even have to plug anything in. Your white balance is totally dialable, controllable from the light source. Doesn't heat up the room. So yeah, from cameras to lighting to audio, all the equipment has changed completely, and the shows and the outlets have changed completely. So yeah. And I think it's not just the television industry. You don't feel like any industry you talk to, they could have a similar story.
Yeah, but Rick, I'm going to suggest all these changes in technology and, as you said, the formatting and where the audience is, I'm betting that that original desire of yours to create a pretty picture that got you started still serves you well.
I would say yes. I think, my photography background served me well. Um, my specialty was sort of tabletop product photography and architecture and fashion. Those were my three areas of expertise. And in fact, I half jokingly had a sign on my studio wall that said, "No weddings, no babies, no pets." And, not to denigrate any of those are excellent specialties. I just felt like those were not my specialties. And I suggest you find someone who that is their specialty, because they're going to probably give you a better product. But yeah, framing, lighting, composition, all those things I did, I think, and the basic technical knowledge of how a lens works, how you control depth of field, the basics of exposure and shutter speed and all those things served me very well. And the other thing I would say is that I've always joked a little bit of OCD is a good thing in this business, because putting everything in its place and, when I would pick up gear versus when I would return it, clients learned that the gear was going to come back undamaged. Everything was put back the way I found it, that kind of stuff. Reliability, the concept I've heard frequently is a good portion of the job is just showing up, and being responsible and being on time, being reliable. But yeah, I'd like to think that my image making had a lot to do with that as well. I did get compliments frequently on making pretty pictures.
Well, I'm going to compliment you on some great stories as well, Rick. I really appreciate you bringing them here today. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info on our website, belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all our social media, so check it out. Rick, we're both pulling for the Dodgers, right? That's Shohei Ohtani. He's something else.
Absolutely. I did go to high school in Northern California, and my grandfather, when he was still alive, used to take me to Giants games at Candlestick Park, and I got to see Willie Mays and McCovey and all the greats back in that era. So for many years, I consider myself a Giants fan, but I came to LA in '69. I've been here ever since, so I have to say I'm a Dodgers fan ever since that time. I couldn't give that up. So yeah, I'm definitely a Dodgers fan. And Dodger Stadium is such a magical place. I really love every opportunity to get up there and watch a game.
For my Dodgers fans out there, I hope this is our year. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. The Below the Line logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.